Yeah, so apologies for the structure of this. When I talk, I usually give like a little background lecture of sort of the things I'm currently thinking about and also things that have consistently inspired me. So uh, I usually structure it that way. So hopefully it's not too esoteric or boring. Um, but yeah, I've been thinking a lot about NPCs. This is a meme that you might see of like a NPC character that is either boring or predictable. But I've been thinking a lot about NPCs in the context of what inspires me in my work because I usually work with code and many different kind of characters, like using code to make websites, using code to make art, using code to make animation. So in a lot of ways, the work I make is kind of like an NPC that sort of operates in different ways. I don't know if anyone has ever played Dark Souls or any sort of game where there's an NPC you have to kind of talk to, but you would think NPCs are kind of boring. Actually, they're just sort of meant to add background to the game or to the experience. But NPCs can actually be quite dynamic. And this particular NPC in Dark Souls, depending on when you talk to him and how you talk to him, you can get different outcomes in the game. And I thought that's like a really cool way to think about design or art is that you provide the player or the user with like possibilities for different outcomes. And this sort of work has always interested me, this idea of like presenting instruction or rules instead of a final product has always been really interesting because you can kind of give people the opportunity to fill in the blanks and create their own work. This is a piece by Yoko Ono called Painting to be Stepped On. And it kind of acts as like a quest to the viewer. Leave a piece of canvas or finished painting on the floor or in the street, and then that's supposed to be the final piece. Although extremely conceptual in nature, it has a lot of like interesting elements to it. It's both just an instruction that can either be taken literally, someone can actually go and do this, or the idea that you sort of make the painting in your head. And this sort of work always inspired me in school and throughout my practice too, just this idea of, yeah, presenting the possibilities instead of the final product. This cryptic bit grid is a actually quite an old graphic. It's over 3,000 years old, actually. It's called the I Ching, and it's from a book of divination where people would sort of predict the future, sort of like a dice roll. So depending on these like stick arrangements, you would sort of be able to predict weather or the idea of like someone's future. And this is like sort of like one of the first ways of generating randomness or chance in sort of it's almost like a divine call of like this is our outcome, but it's all just sort of chance. And what's interesting about this kind of rule set is that some artists would use it to not really predict the future, but sort of to compose work. And then one artist that is really inspirational to me, John Cage, would use this system to not predict the future, but to score music. So the original book where the I Ching comes from is called Book of Changes. And John Cage would often use it in his work, but most prominently in this piece called Music of Changes, where he would dictate tempo, tone, all these different things with this sort of random grid. Um, so all of these sort of like artists and ideas and this idea of adding chance into your work actually drew me to graphic design first. I was a designer for quite a while, and that's what I studied. Not that graphic design offers a lot of randomness. A lot of a graphic designer's job, obviously, is to add structure and sort of predictability. But in between the sort of the style guide or the rules of a brand or a graphic system, there's like kind of a lot of chance that can happen either through production or whoever's using the work. And I've always quite liked that sort of opportunity for things to um, evolve in a way that the designer didn't even know. This sort of thinking also led me to look at the web, not only just websites, but artists who work inherently to the web. The internet came about in, I always mix this up, it's either 1995 or 96. But that's the year where the web was first like an internet browser. The internet has existed for like since the 70s pretty much, but the actual web that we know today was sort of started in the mid 90s. And this piece by Olia Leolina, I always forget her name, Olia Leolina, was one of the first artworks that was sort of distributed to the browser. And it's really fascinating because I'm sure at the time people were probably like, well, why are you using the internet? It's such a weird thing, you know, it was a new thing. But she took it as an opportunity to bring a new life to her work and through like telling a story. So if any of you have designed like a sitemap before, this is sort of the sitemap of that website. And through it, you have a lot of different decisions you can make to have this journey through the web page. And so she's allowing the users to kind of explore their own path through the website. And this is like a pretty like new idea, this idea of like the web being its own medium, and the web being extremely interactive and generative. This this is one of my favorite pieces of net art, and it still sticks with me to this day. It's called Form by Alexei Shulgin, also made, I would say, around 1997, pretty early on. But Alexei Shulgin was really fascinating because he would take the graphic forms of the web, which are just these like, you know, text inputs, buttons, checks, and all this stuff. And he would sort of make a very interactive series of work called Form that was a website. But the most interesting part of this work is that he sort of saw the web as a material. So the idea of like buttons are, they have a look and feel. They're sort of digital material. And if you ever programmed in HTML, you'll know that the buttons and the inputs have their own styling. So you don't need to like even dictate the styling of these things. They have an automatic styling. And this automatic styling changes over time. So his whole idea was like, yeah, maybe this website changes a lot over the years because the defaults of the present always change. So he's thinking about this like idea of longevity in the web. So all those things kind of combined has led me down like a practice where I'm deeply interested in like creating chance in work, while also like exploring different fields. Like I said, I started as a graphic designer, and most of the projects I tried to do, I would try to inject some sort of like dynamic identity into the work. And the last full-time job I had, which was a while ago, like 2017, is when I was last like a real graphic designer. But whenever I tried to do a project, I would try to like inject some sort of system or tool where sort of the client could be in control of how things evolve, and me as the designer could sit back and be like, oh, that's cool that they made that decision, or I wouldn't even think of that. So this was one of the first projects where I took a system where you couldn't really adequately design it. It's using every typeface that the New York Times has a series of like 30 plus colors. And so I made this sort of this tool where the client could use it and compose all these different elements that would be otherwise too messy to handle. So I actually quit that job. I was really happy at that place. It's called Base Design. They were really interested in this idea of creating generative work, but I actually found that I had more fun coding these graphic systems than just presenting PDFs or something like that. So I began like a pretty rigorous practice of coding every day, trying to make systems that were interesting, that change with time and stuff like this. I'd often publish websites that were more or less experiments or art pieces of themselves, kind of documenting things I'm learning and working on. This is a project called Waiting for June. It's just a circle that becomes a circle once a year. And I would often get inquired to do websites because I was coding at the time. So around 2018, I started to build a design and development practice. And the whole idea was that the website would sort of take precedent over any sort of graphic system there, and sort of injecting sort of chance for the user to interact with the website in many different ways. So I would do pretty traditional things, do branding and stuff like that, but I would always try to inject, these ideas that the graphic forms are made in sort of a chance way. So whereas one process would normally be you design the logo, then you do the print, then you do the website, I tried to like flip that around where the website would sort of create the forms for the logo. In this project called Arc, the user could sort of like shift the logo in this like ever evolving arc, and that would sort of make the forms for the logo. And during that time, I was like also getting hit up to do animation. I think coding and animation have like a really significant tie to each other because it's a time-based medium. And so Alexander Wang reached out for me to do like an animation for their homepage. And then I was sort of like, well, why don't we just make a sort of interactive animation? And this was sort of the first time I was like, oh, it's cool that the users can kind of dictate how things animate and how they sort of see the work. At the same time, just having it be pretty controlled in how the outcome is. And then I was also getting reached out for more generative work. This was around 2018. This idea of like, well, maybe it's not even a website, maybe it's a series of graphics made with code that output themselves in animation and print and all this stuff. I got reached out by Nike to do sort of a graphic for their identity for it's called Nike Moonshot, which is like a 16-week training program. So the whole idea was that we create these generative moon so people can sort of like see the evolution of this 16-week program. And it was a really weird project because they're like, they brought me in. I'm like, well, what do you want me to do? Animation or logos or what, and they're like, just do your thing, just make generative stuff. And it was like pretty ahead of its time because not a lot of clients or people understood like creative coding and how that worked. And so it was really cool to be able to work in that context because I think it informed a lot of my later work. And then in 2020, 2021, the real NPCs arrived. And these are, for those who don't know, like generative artwork became more of a main idea through the invention of like Web3 and the blockchain. Most of like crypto is like a scam, I would say. So I would stay away. But there is one aspect of it that is really interesting, and not a lot of people know about it. This project, Cryptpunks, was a less interesting conceptual idea, but had a really interesting technical idea presented, in that these weren't really drawn, pixel art. They were sort of assembled randomly. And 10,000 of them got minted very slowly. They weren't really a big deal when they were minted. It was more of an experiment by this project called Larva Labs. And they sort of just presented the project as an experiment, being like, you can write a piece of code that will assemble SVGs together in a random way. So every time somebody mints something or purchases it, you get some sort of random output. To put it short, it's like the idea of something generative kind of became viable in this way. And a lot of my practice from that point has become making scripts, making generative code that doesn't really need a sort of website to host it or a branding brief to host it. So it's been actually quite nice to be able to work generatively. So I thought I would sort of outline two scripts that I've mutated and worked on over the past couple of years. things I kind of keep coming back to, and then show some work, some more recent work that I've been sort of outputting with. This is a Game Boy. So the Game Boy is a really fascinating machine because I had to use very little pixels to, dictate color, dictate depth, and draw arts that people would play with, right? And they use this method called dithering. Dithering is sort of like, it's like a Photoshop preset, right? When you sort of export something with little color, it'll say, do you want to dither it? And what's really interesting is that dithering came from this term in the war where they were trying to print out enemy planes and stuff. They had these little needles that would draw the sort of cartography of the area and show where the enemy planes are. And they realized that the printer worked better up on the plane when they were in the air because it would have a little bit of randomness to the pen, and it created like a more realistic image than it just being still. So this idea of dithering actually came back into popularity with electronics because they needed a way to render light and render sort of these gradients of pictures without it looking too stale. So the Game Boy is actually a fascinating machine because for anyone who is technology savvy, you'll know that 8 kilobits of RAM is it's not a lot. You're not working with this these iPhones that we have today, or these screens we have today. This is a very minimal machine. And so you're only working with 4 colors. So how do you generate light and depth with only these 4 colors? So they've invented this way of using patterns to dictate light. And it's pretty straightforward. You have this gradient from light to black, and you just fill in the pixels a certain way, and you'll be able to get that gradient. And what's crazy about this is that these images are still in my mind because they're so great, right? Like, I don't know, if anyone grew up playing games or something, you might have the same mental image of these images, but they're extremely restrained images. And I think a lot of the beauty and the depth of these come from this like dithering idea. And it's a very old idea. Many machines besides video games use this sort of method of rendering colors. Even 250 colors is not a lot. And there's lots of different kinds of dithering that end up being like this. So I became really fascinated with dithering, both because it has a sort of nostalgia for me, I think, but it's also like this extremely restrained graphic technique of rendering images. And I became kind of obsessed with it. And so I started to build scripts around projects, generative projects. The first project that I kind of built a much larger script was this project called Maps. The goal of Maps was really to create this 2-color representation of land or an environment through this idea of like biomes in different places. And I tried to also print these. So I wanted to pick colors from, that could be reproducible in print. And this idea that, they sort of come together through this idea of dithering. And so the outputs of these are not me, picking the pixel. They're randomly generated through a generative script. And it was cool to be able to use this dithering and sort of break it and sort of like have it mutate and show all of its like impressionistic variations. And I became really sort of enamored with the sort of random outputs from this project. And this is it doesn't look like a print, but this is the print of it. And so that sort of work got me a lot of other work. I was called to do a lot of editorial work. I think people were really drawn to this idea of drawing images in a way that felt unique. And so I'll show a lot of like work that came from that. I do a lot of work for the New York Times. So I was doing like a lot of editorial illustration. This was about microchips in Taiwan. It was an animation for this idea of like manufacturing Taiwanese microchips and the conflicts there. Another project about the sort of border wars of data. and this idea of like nationalistic data. Apparently in 2020, the Chromebook was really popular, and then it wasn't. So that was an article about. This was an article about that. This is an article about artificial intelligence and sort of the implication of this. I also did some print work. I got asked to do like a series of spreads for a magazine out here called Baffler, where I sort of used AI in my scripts to sort of make these like images from like a distant future, and sort of like, yeah, really showing how the script can work and create these variations. This is a project for Bloomberg Business Week. It was about these hackers like hacked into a hospital in Ireland. And yeah, some renderings from this. This is a poster for an artist named Doss, who's great. You should check her out, by the way. Just a sort of graphic poster for her. If anyone plays Diablo, I got asked to do like a article for The Atlantic about Diablo, which I was really excited about because I love that game. And this sort of work led to some more recent work where I use sort of a combination of GAN images and my scripts. But I was also trying to think about like what is the material of the web and technology, and I was thinking about screenshots quite a bit. And screenshots are really interesting, right? Because they're kind of from the past, but they're also like we keep them on our computer. It could just be like a memory. So I was really interested in creating like these ideas of memories because it's such a nostalgic look, but also trying to think about like what feels new. So these are all sort of like newly generated images, but they have such a nostalgic feel or connection. So I made a collection of 64 of these, but this is sort of the process of making them. I would bring them into my scripts and then render them, but then I would sort of screenshot them on this old iMac that I got for my birthday, which adds like a whole nother texture to them. I just like watching that. Yeah, so there's a bunch of different variations here, which is really nice because I was really excited by how these look, and they're extremely graphic. And what's really interesting about the scripts this particular script is how it sort of interpolates light, because I add a bunch of errors to the script that somewhat like screw with how light works, but I think that's like kind of the more beautiful parts of it. Okay, I'll talk about one more script and then that'll be done. Another script that I keep coming back to is the script for Elisa Curve. If anyone's into like synthesizers or interfaces for music, you might recognize forms like this. The idea of it is like, how do you draw curvatures in circles using code? And what it uses is these frequencies. For example, a frequency of 1 and 1 will create like a circle that revolves, kind of like this. And so these different frequencies create these Lissajous curves. Some of them look like DNA, some of them look like a pretzel, some of them look like a circle. And I just really love these forms. And it comes into my work a lot because with generative work, you're sort of creating something from nothing. So you really need like a driver for form that can create a lot of variation. And this is one that I just am really visually drawn to. I've done some editorial work with this. Ironically enough, it was for a crypto crashing article for the New York Times, just about the volatility of it, which was pretty fun to do actually. But yeah, I tend to use these curves a lot. I feel like it like draws a lot to like poetry or like kind of visual poetry or something that just feels a little more expressive. It's hard to pinpoint actually. This is a piece in Germany that exhibited last year or not this summer. Yeah, this past summer. We're not in January yet. Yeah, and I tend to use these curves a lot when it kind of feels like typesetting in a way that like feels like kinetic or in motion. This piece is called To See a Wave as a Sliding Door. This was sort of like exhibited in between two sliding doors, which is pretty nice. And then I got asked to do a generative work for an exhibition surrounded by this idea of imperfections. So I really wanted to show this script, this sort of Lisa Ju script, and how it attempts to draw a circle, but you kind of have some failures along the way. So it really, it's a script that is about drawing a circle, but it's like constantly failing. So you almost never get like a perfect circle. And you sort of show how the code is trying to continually draw it. And that was exhibited the same spot in London, actually. It's I forget the location, but it's on the west side. Yeah, and this also came up again. I was working on taking some of my JavaScript pieces and trying to like use more devices, because I got asked more often to show my work, and I really hate showing work digitally on a screen. It kind of feels like a cop-out, or like there's nothing really interesting about it. So I was thinking about devices and things that I could sort of use to bring concepts into my work. And I thought this would be a really good piece for NFTs because NFTs are these like transactional jokes in a way. So I have this sort of like kinetic poem that just goes ha 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 over and over again, but I'm sort of composing it in these different Lisa Ju curves. Here's the physical scans of this. And this was sort of a gallery view of it recently. I exhibited it last week. And so I made a sort of digital version of it. It's kind of even hard to see the difference, but yeah, I sort of made this typeface that could be embedded on sort of like, the tough thing about generative work is that you can't have like fonts. So I had to kind of create this like little bitmap font for it. And then, yeah, was exhibited in London last week. And then one last piece is this piece called Overtime, which was showed with this work. And this was, really referencing all of my my love for net art, and wanted to sort of contribute to that idea of the web changing over time. And so, yeah, it's using this curve to sort of create these like looping animations using the interface. And I guess a lot during this time, I was thinking about like, yeah, what is the materiality of digital things? I don't think there's like one answer to that, but I'm really curious about like, is the interface a material? Is the pixel a material? Is how the work's shown the material? And I think that's like a really, like a question I keep asking myself when I'm working these days. And this piece is great because depending on the browser and where you're looking at it, you'll get these different results.
Yeah, that was really good. Thank you very much. I'm actually the one closer to the books of changes here, I think, in terms of knowledge on technology. No, but I don't know. Looking at your works, there's something so I can't use the word human, but definitely like almost like organic, biological, something alive going on, right? So I was just interested, like, do you consider the tools you use almost like as your business partner? As in, like, is there a dialogue between the two of you, or you've got something in your head and you just use them to create whatever is in your head? How does that work in terms of process?
Yeah, I wish I had like an answer that was as concrete as like, yeah, my technology is my business partner and we are one and one. But I feel like I'm mostly like fighting with it. I think like when you're coding, you're constantly frustrated. And early on, I remember getting really frustrated at things. I'm like, well, what if I just do this instead? And it's mostly like you sort of like break it in your own way, write your own versions of scripts. If I was a better programmer, I would probably make less interesting things because I would know exactly what to do. So I'd say a lot of the like imperfection that you see in the work it's just through like me experimenting and trying to have fun with it, and sometimes fighting with it, because yeah, I feel like there's like a lot of unexplored form, and not a lot of people go into programming like, I'm going to make something visually interesting or conceptually interesting. People are mostly just trying to make something efficient and very rudimentary visually. So yeah, I think I have the most fun when I'm thinking about these scripts, right? These scripts that you have a lot of different, have years and years of knowledge. People have iterated on them, people have used them, and try to find my own way in, like what is interesting to me. So yeah, sometimes a business partner, sometimes an adversary.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You might want to come closer. I don't have a question, but I can't see his face.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting. I am also not a designer, and I was just curious about like time and how long these projects take.
Yeah, like something like the longer scripts, the generative scripts, they can take like 3 months to years, right? Like it's just me sort of figuring out the system and stuff like this. But then the commercial works, I don't know if anyone's ever done editorial design stuff, but it's like a 2-day turnaround. So like some of the editorial stuff is really quick. So I tend to think of it as like I have this really long project that might go a few years, and that script itself might have different iterations over time. So yeah, I would say like the longer generative scripts maybe could take years of fiddling with, but then the outputs from it might just kind of exit along the way, if that makes sense.
In terms of especially through some of the images that are generated, and you showed an image that was on one of the old iMacs, and you said you enjoyed watching it.
Yeah.
Is that generated by inputting a number of source images that it then creates an output based on, or is it generating the physical context or subject matter of the images as well?
So yeah, I did run like a GAN, which is like I guess AI thing.
Okay.
So it's combining a bunch of different avenues. For that project, I tried to like do something a little different. But the pixelation you see is actually made on a modern computer with my script. But like screenshotting it, you get all these like little details on these old screens, because like I said, the old screens had like 250 colors or something. So you get all this old, like these like artifacts, and the whole project was about like screenshots as an object, because screenshots are kind of imperfect and have this like material to them. So yeah, it's like a mixture between me manually generating a bunch of GAN images and sort of collaging them in Photoshop and creating a set, and then sort of bringing them through this process of pixelating old Mac, bringing them back, and that was like one of my more manual processes for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go on, Pat.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, Matt. That's super interesting. The I Ching thing is amazing. Can't believe that's 3,000 years old. It's mental. My question was sort of when you were sort of transitioning at the end of your sort of, let's say, graphic part and into more of the coding stuff, you talked about the idea of like bringing chance into your work, which is kind of super interesting, because I suppose from our point of view, we often have this kind of conversation around how I suppose you can push your client outside of the kind of comfort zone in a way, and get them comfortable with something that they may not expect. So I was curious to know, like, how did you navigate that that idea of like getting someone comfortable with the idea of like chance, and that it not being as like prescripted or as defined or as structured each time someone was experiencing, a brand or a campaign or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I could talk for like hours on this, because I really loved like branding at the time, because I think during that time dynamic identities started to become more and more popular, and I thought that was just so cool, and I thought the idea of like creating a system that could change is so much more interesting than just like a drawn logo. And so I spent a lot of like frustrating client meetings where I would present an idea, maybe the logo changes, annually, changes with weather, and it wasn't even like crazy changes, just sort of atmospheric ones. And the client would just be like, yeah, but like, what's the logo we use on our business card? What's the, this was at a more corporate, I worked at Wolf Allen, so it's much more like corporate stuff. And then I think when I sort of started to work with clients that were a little smaller and cultural, they were more open to that. They just had less money, And I found my clients that I got, since I was working with the web first, and I got something in their face, here's the website. The logo changes like this, but this is your logo, And they got way more comfortable seeing like a little demo. So I became really obsessed with coding a lot of the graphic ideas that I had. And then soon I became way more interested in that than making the PDF for the branding guideline or something. Yeah.
So you got them comfortable with the idea of chance by letting them experience what that chance could mean for them in a way.
Yeah, like in the first meeting, I would just kind of have a little website demo where they could sort of see it working. And then I think people are way more open when they kind of can understand it. I think people just don't understand it sometimes and how practical it is. But on the web, people are way more open to that, I think.
Yeah, and I was going to ask on that point as well. Do you think, I mean, probably maybe things have changed slightly, but do you think at the point you were showing it in a web demo, people were more comfortable with that, with being a bit more of a kind of what's the word, non-structured space versus some of those kind of more traditional ways people might interact with a brand, i.e. a poster or whatever it might be? So there was a bit more, people viewed it as a space where there could be a bit more freedom.
I think so. I think it's also just it's up to the client how like daring they want to be. And I guess like the idea of something more unbranded is maybe more popular these days. So maybe it's like easier to kind of pitch, ideas more around tone than like one graphic shape or something. But back then I felt like, people just wanted that like mark for their app or something, that logo. So that was really hard to get away from. See, I'm not sure. Maybe it's just about the type of client it is. I don't think it works for like 90% of clients because, sometimes they just need that mark. That's sort of why I got out of the graphic design like business, because I'm like, maybe I'm not meant for this this kind of this track here. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, I had a question, but I'm struggling to know how to word it, so I'll just try saying something. I thought it was really interesting as you were kind of going through, because obviously code and sort of digital work is so logical, and there's sort of an input, there's an output. I think what was really interesting as well is, like, I guess the shift with AI technology and the development of technology, and the question mark around when people say, is AI creative, or is imagery created through those things actually creative or original? And I think it's just interesting when you're talking about the kind of when things are generated through inputs, there's actually moments that were never expected, and sort of they kind of birth, I guess, essentially a creative moment. I guess maybe the question is, sort of, do you see that technology will ultimately be a creative thing in its own right? Like, it can actually be creative, rather than, I guess, people at the moment think it's sort of a replication, it's just an input-based thing, but actually it could form its own creativity and create things. If that makes sense.
No, yeah, I think it does. I think there's like I'm on TikTok a lot. And there's a bunch of channels. They're like 15-year-old kids who use Midjourney and stuff. And they've gotten so good at the prompts and what they can get out of it. Like, and no one can figure out what they're prompting. So I don't know if you ever use Midjourney, but it's like all prompt based, right? So I do think there's an art to like the prompt, like how you sort of create the image. I'm not that good at it. I think it's a skill of its own. But I would say like the images that you get from AI unfortunately look like AI. You're just like, oh, that's AI. I could tell. Even if it's like really well rendered, your brain kind of like turns off and you're like, that's just AI. I'm not gonna pay attention to it. So I like to think of AI in its current state as like more of a starting point for a project, or like 10% of a project. You can maybe start with that image and then collage it or edit it or something like that. I think it's really interesting source material. But yeah, it's hard for me to be like, I just want to make AI images and that's like the final output, if that makes sense. I don't really find that super interesting, but I think there's a lot of cool things you can do with it. But yeah, it's hard to know how fast it's going to go and how destructive its path to the labor market will be. So I kind of like, I'm just looking at it and just sort of observing it and playing with it, but it's hard for me to be like, yeah, AI is so cool with the future, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense.
Where do you believe your practice now evolves? Because obviously you develop scripts, you then adapt, evolve those scripts to suit or to fit the purpose of what you're trying to produce. Where do you believe your practice now evolves? Where are the territories that you think that you move towards that maybe you haven't had an opportunity to think about or play around with? Or even, as I said, you've obviously now, I really appreciated the exhibition stuff that you've done. It was really beautiful, especially where you've taken something that's digital, put it back into something so straightforward, like a receipt, kind of like a ticker. I don't know what they're specifically called. They're like carbon paper, right? So I think that's what they are.
They use no ink. Yeah.
Yeah. So where do you like? If we take commerciality out of the picture and clients approaching you for a specific project, what is that kind of burning curiosity of where you want to go and explore next? Where did your practice evolve towards?
I mean, no idea, but I feel like at the current moment, what's really fun is like making the scripts and people respond to it, and then being able to like work with clients sometimes, like collaborators and stuff. So like having the mix is really nice for me, where it's like, okay, I can do this like kind of self-generated project that involves me like researching and doing these scripts. But then also having like I'm doing like an album cover for Steve Reich right now, you know. So like having that balance of like, you know, commercial work, I actually quite like it because you know, maybe it's my background, but I like having some like jobs that are working with others. So like an ideal world, I could sort of like, yeah, just continue making a living like this. But I would say like the majority of like what I'm working on in the future is that I'm showing much more work. So I think like before I go into a script, having like an object or like a material in mind to like kind of show it. So like always thinking about like a physical way to show the work that is like inherently digital is a really fun problem to solve. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about the mix of things, I guess, currently, and I hope to just kind of keep that going. But then also like, yeah, how much play I can have in the work.
There was something really nice about how the early web, there was this real like creative community in a way that does not work at all like it works today. Although we have Instagram, although we have TikTok, although we are all, you know, much more open and communicative with each other, I feel like there's something really nostalgic about the way these creative communities used to work with the early web. Do you find that going back to do something like that, you found that kind of initial creative community back as well? Or do you find that actually it's hard to find, if you know what I mean?
No, I know exactly what you mean. I feel like it's funny, I have a show tonight opening in this like old school. It's 53 artists who do kind of the similar things as me. Some of them are, you know, they do generative art, some of them do more traditional art, some of them are like programmer, creative coders. It's the first time I've ever felt like, oh, these are all my people, you know, these are all like, we're all sort of like playing with the same materials and things. So I actually, and when I teach a workshop that revolves around generative art, and it's really nice to see people that come and are really interested in this stuff. So I've been lucky enough to find like a physical colloquial community of people who are all sort of interested in the web and like, you know, the history of the web, but also the future of it. I tend to like latch on to people who are like really experimental, but at the same time they want to play with new technology. And I tend to shy away from people that are like, yeah, the future is AI, you know, like the future is everything, you know, they go full steam ahead on technology. And I think like for the most part, the net artists that I showed, you know, that sort of shared similar ideas, I think they were looked at as like kind of weird people because the web was really early, and actually people were like pretty much dismissing the web up until like the early 2000s because it seemed like a fad or something. So I see them as like kind of outcasts, you know, they're kind of like trying their own thing and just trying to experiment with the medium. So they're very brave. I don't think people were like, everyone was like, yeah, that's the coolest thing. I think they were maybe looked at as like weird for trying this new technology that wasn't a real art artifact, you know what I mean? So I think they did that so that in like 20 years, people could be like, whoa, that's cool, like right now, you know? So I think that's interesting. And I think there are people like that today, but it's like, yeah, it's its own thing for sure.
Cool, thanks.
I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. I think your work is inspiring, but I think more so than that, the way in which you communicate it is even more so. So I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.